Um, so I'm a little bit tired, and that if that comes across in the video because I've been up all night. But I've just come across a video, and I believe it's from the Liberal Democrat conference from last year from Glasgow. Um, and it's based on a fringe event, as they call it, by Jeremy Brown, who's a senior Liberal Democrat, I think a possible future leader of the party. And he's talking about the rise of UKIP. Now, before I continue, I want to absolutely stress that at the exact moment I'm not aligned to any political party. I do have sympathies to the Liberal Democrats, and I'll explain that towards the end of the video. But at the moment, I honestly don't have any particular. I don't have a specific allegiance to any party in the sense that I'm not at the moment a member of any party. Um, but looking at this, I think Jeremy Brown made some very interesting points, and some things were striking. First of all, I'll speak a little bit about what he actually said. In this speech that he was making, and there were other videos from other Liberal Democrats. I haven't seen those, but I was interested in Jeremy Brown because he was one of the contributors, I believe, of the Orange Book, which is generally seen as more to the right of the party, those who sort of promote economic liberalism as opposed to the centre-left social liberals. Nick Clegg was also a contributor to the Orange Book. Within the Liberal Democrat Party, incidentally, that is sort of it's a pretty big deal, let's just say. But anyway, one thing that struck me about this was there were several UKIP people, by which I mean presumably UKIP supporters, commenting below the video. And I really get the impression they didn't watch the video. Because if they had, and if they were being honest, they wouldn't have left the sort of comments they were leaving. There were about 3 or 4 UKIP, pro UKIP comments there. And let's say about 3 of them out of the 4 were not coming up with any rational counter arguments, but simply throwing out insults. Uh, Something along the lines of Jeremy Brown is a posh twat, he's going to lose in May, this sort of thing. Now, okay, in politics you do get that sort of mudslinging, and it's a normal part of politics. Not a particularly good part of politics, but normal. But it does make me think that there's something rather striking about that. Anyway, one of the UKIP supporters said something which I found quite interesting. He said that Jeremy Brown was arrogant. Now, what he actually said in the speech, and I'll put a link on this video, is that those who are trying to understand the rise of UKIP, who don't support UKIP, do need to step back a bit and not simply dismiss them in a certain way. I think he was being very reasonable in that speech. Now, people could say I'm biased because I'm sympathetic to the Liberal Democrats, but I am still a swing voter. I'm not 100% settled in the Dems, but I'm sympathetic. Now, that speech to me came across as very reasonable. What Jeremy Brown was clearly saying is that people who vote UKIP, in many cases, are normal, reasonable people who have genuine concerns and convictions. And I believe that too. What he was saying broadly echoes my own sentiments. I've been following UKIP for a long time, and I followed the sort of response they have come out with to criticism. And it basically goes along these lines. From my impression, UKIP sees itself as a radical force of taking on the establishment lib lab con, as they would call it. Um, and it is an understandable reaction in many ways to several years of high profile scandals, for one thing, but also a number of major controversies that have affected all 3 big parties. I mean, Labour is tarnished with being seen as being responsible for the recession, which I think is a bit unfair to blame it entirely on Labour. It was a worldwide recession. but basically Labour is seen as mismanaging the economy. The Tories are held in controversial terms, let's say, because they have stubbornly stood by the tabloid press at the height of phone hacking. They've been out of touch on a very large number of issues, and the sort of areas where they were traditionally seen as more hard line, I think some of their core voters have abandoned them to UKIP because they've been seen as out of touch on those issues. Issues like immigration, perhaps crime. Actually, interestingly enough, crime is one issue that UKIP seems to be quite quiet on. I haven't seen UKIP talk a great deal about crime. In fact, come to think about it, crime generally hasn't been a big issue in this election, which maybe indicates that violent crime levels have actually decreased in this country. But that's, I don't want to go off on a tangent on that. So yeah, and in the case of the Liberal Democrats, well, Nick Clegg is tarnished with the whole tuition fees thing. I might make another video specifically about the Lib Dems and I'll address that issue. I find that when parties have had experience of government, they will always, always, always have to counter an idea that they're establishment simply because they've been in government. That's especially the case with Labour and the Conservatives, and now the Lib Dems as well. Um, but the thing is, it is actually quite easy to be populist. And whilst UKIP claims that it is radical, uh, they base that on the fact that they're the only party that wants to leave the EU. But actually, the sort of populism they're using is not that different from the Greens and the SNP and other parties, because all of the smaller parties use pretty much the same rhetoric about standing up to the establishment, the Westminster elite, as they would all put it, including UKIP. So in that sense, UKIP actually has more in common with the SNP and the Greens than they think, because they use exactly the same rhetoric. Of course, the SNP and the Greens are centre left. Well, the Greens are arguably far left in some ways, um, whereas UKIP would probably be described as definitely to the right. I wouldn't want to put a sort of marker on exactly where the pendulum lies, but the point is they all do have one thing in common in that they claim to be against the establishment. But if UKIP's position on this, I think they need to make their mind up. If they're going to continue using this sort of populist language about being against the establishment, that indicates to me that they want to remain a small party. If they continue to talk about being anti-establishment, and the thing about that is that's all very well, but then it makes me wonder, well, do you have any ambition? Do you actually want to? I'm just plugging this in. Excuse me a second. Yeah, it makes me wonder, does UKIP actually have ambition? Does it actually want to be a party of government? Because if it does, then it can constantly use this populist language. Now, it's clever in a general election when the three big parties are struggling to get the sort of support levels that they once had. Then, yeah, populism definitely works. So, from a strategy point of view, it's clever. But anyway, those might be some of the reasons why people have been attracted to UKIP. And I fully accept that the European Union, um, especially because of the way it is covered in the tabloid press, is very controversial in this country. There is a large number of people that do frankly hate the EU and want us out. Of course, Mr Farage is clever enough to not use those sort of terms. And I mean hate, he never says I hate the EU, but he's clever enough to turn the public against it. And it isn't just the EU, they also use populism on immigration. Now, I know I've looked at their website. Actually, their immigration policies aren't that extreme, certainly not as much as people think. But what Jeremy Brown was getting at this in his video was the opposite, actually, of how UKIP portrays its opponents. Because UKIP, I believe, is astonishingly arrogant and hypocritical, and a lot of its supporters, frankly, are as well, based on what I've seen online. In in the notion that I've seen UKIP supporters, for example, say that we are all against the LibLabCon, Now, we'll see what happens on May the 7th. No one can be absolutely sure what happens then. I personally think that the Dems will lose support. UKIP will gain a bit. But on May the 7th, if the big three parties uh, continue to get a lot of support, then UKIP cannot simply say that, the whole country's stupid, why didn't you vote for us? There is something very arrogant about UKIP in that, of course, every party leader has to encourage the public to vote for his or her party. It's part of the job. But I'm getting a little bit fed up with UKIP supporters claiming to be radical and claiming to be the only people who care about the country. That's incredibly arrogant. Um, there's another aspect to Mr. Farage himself. He whinges about getting a hard time in the press, but he's not exactly respectful to his opponents. He's demanding that he gets respect and his party gets respect, but I would turn that around and say, wait a second, look at most UKIP supporters online and tell me honestly, are they respectful to their opponents? UKIP and its supporters constantly say that they're victims of a smear campaign, and whilst there may be some truth in that, especially from more hard left sources, um, this also comes back down to UKIP's attitude to its opponents. Whenever Mr. Farage is in debates, he doesn't exactly try to be diplomatic. Now, he will say that's blunt talking, but it does definitely have an indication of how a party comes across. And it indicates to me that they're not actually trying to reach out to people at all. Um, I am yet to see, or at least the majority of UKIP comments that I see online are not like, we disagree with these parties, but I believe UKIP is best for the country and I'm going to vote for them for that reason. It's more like some actually rather, let's say, harsh things to say about rival parties. Um, it's a bit rich for UKIP supporters to talk about their party not getting respect when they're showing no respect themselves. It's complete double standards. Um, if you support UKIP, um, I'm not going to question your reason for doing so. But if you come out with comments like the sort of things that I saw on that video, then frankly, to me, it just reeks of double standards. And I've seen it a lot, actually. UKIP is always on the defensive and always saying that, oh, we're being victimized by the media, but they don't exactly help their own case. Maybe if they were just a little bit more civil to some of their opponents, then it might be. And I'm fully aware that there are people who don't like UKIP who are not exactly civil to them. But let's be clear here: the mob that attacked Nigel Farage in a pub is a far left mob. They don't represent the many, many, many people who don't like UKIP and who wouldn't use that sort of behaviour. So UKIP supporters can't just say that it's some big far left conspiracy against them, because a lot of people, myself included, and by the way, Nick Clegg, condemned that mob attack on Mr. Farage and his family. That's stupid. But, this video, what Jeremy Brown was trying to do is he was trying to be reasonable and he was trying to say, look, we do need to understand where people are coming from with this. There are concerns about immigration. There are concerns about British values being lost, British traditions being lost. So he was trying to reach out. And the response I saw from UKIP supporters was he's a posh twat. In other words, attacking the man for his voice. That doesn't sound like a very convincing argument. And yet the same people would probably whinge about Nigel Farage being called a racist. So it all comes down to what is actually civil political debate. I I would be prepared to be engaged in a civil debate with anyone if they were civil to myself. But politics is a blood sport. It is tough, and I'm not naive. I can see that, but I just think there's a lot of double standards with UKIP, and I also think it's profoundly arrogant when UKIP supporters seem to think that everyone agrees with them and everyone has the same mentality as them. Actually, they don't. Actually, this isn't some big media conspiracy against UKIP. Maybe can you consider for a second that actually it's because people genuinely disagree. Now, I know that the media is powerful. I know that political parties can have their positions distorted. And I know that the extreme statements from UKIP councillors don't represent the whole party. However, UKIP's image problem, they cannot continuously blame that on the media, which is pretty much what they do. UKIP's constantly on the defensive, but in my opinion, they haven't done anywhere near enough to help their own image. Yes, Nigel Farage has enacted strict rules in terms of membership and so on. Yes, he has went out of his way to try and show that he's personally moderate, at least in terms of his views, but he hasn't shown a lot of respect for his political opponents. And that doesn't come across well, quite frankly. Whereas here we have Jeremy Brown, a Liberal Democrat, trying to say, look, we need to understand why people support UKIP. So I think UKIP does frankly come across as very arrogant at times, especially when UKIP supporters seem to think that everybody must agree with them. I mean, it seems to me the other political parties don't tell people you have to agree with them. They do try to encourage people to understand their way of thinking because that's politics, that's how you get votes. But when it comes to UKIP voters, it's like, if you don't agree with us, then you're a traitor. That is the sort of mentality of a lot of UKIP voters, and I'm sick of it. And I do see this arrogance quite frequently. I am not saying this is every UKIP voter, I'm not saying that, but I'm just saying it is quite prevalent. So stop whinging and start to really look at where the negative image is coming from, and consider maybe it is how UKIP treats its political opponents. Stop constantly playing the victim. We'll see what happens on May the 7th. I think UKIP will do pretty well. I don't think they'll do as well as they're claiming they're going to do. Not talking about Nigel Farage, but UKIP supporters seem to think they're going to have a landslide on May the 7th, and they're going to be in for a bit of a hangover when they realise that won't happen. Now, it may well be that the Liberal Democrats lose votes and seats, but I don't think it'll be the complete wipeout that people are predicting. Why? Well, I said at the start of this video, I would explain why I'm sympathetic to the Liberal Democrats. I believe the Lib Dems under Nick Clegg are offering a pragmatic centrist approach. Now, when you really, really think about that, to me, that is what Britain needs. And it doesn't mean that I agree with every single policy area with the Lib Dems. I need to analyse everything. And I take my vote very, very seriously. So, I wouldn't throw my vote to any political party without really, really thinking about it. Just for the record, I don't absolutely disagree with everything UKIP stands for. I think they do make a lot of fair points. But what puts me off about UKIP is they rely on populism. They really do. And one day, if they really are ambitious, they will need the responsibility of governing. And the populism will no longer work. Because the Lib Dems also started off as a small party, although the history is slightly different because they also came out of the SDP and the Old Liberal um, merge, obviously in 1988. UKIP, I believe, to my understanding, they came out of this fight the Tories in the early 90s. Actually, Jeremy Brown made an interesting point. Had Nigel Farage stayed within the Conservative Party, he probably would have done pretty well as a Eurosceptic Tory MP. Now, I will say one thing for Nigel Farage. I could say a lot about him, but to his credit, I do believe he's a conviction politician. I do believe he speaks his mind, and I do believe he has conviction. But that does not mean he is right on everything. And having charisma, whilst it's very handy, and whilst it makes you very skilled in terms of political tectonics, in terms of debating, in terms of getting popular sympathies, it doesn't not mean he is right about everything. And UKIP supporters, I'm not talking about people who are sympathetic and who sort of are considering lending their vote to UKIP. I can understand that. I really, really can. I'm talking about hardcore UKIP supporters who come onto videos like that and come out with extreme sort of nationalist statements like vote UKIP or you're a traitor. I've honestly seen things like this. You'll never hear a Lib Dem talking like that. Say what you want about the other three parties, but how often do you hear a Conservative, a Labour, or a Lib Dem talking in those sort of terms? That's why, they say it's establishment. I call it moderation. And of the big three parties, the Liberal Democrats are by far the most centrist. Now, surely, this is a time to be embracing the radical centre. So, of all the parties right now, I am most sympathetic to the Liberal Democrats. And I think Nick Clegg is being hugely underestimated. Um, the Lib Dems will suffer on May the 7th, but I don't think they'll suffer as much as people think. And I think it'll be very interesting to see the outcome.